everybody to our lecture series Beyond Ashkenaz, Sephardim and Other Jews. On behalf of Professor Sina Rauschenbach, Professor for Religious Studies and Jewish Thought at the University of Potsdam, I am very much delighted to invite you to participate on our lecture today. Today, it's our special pleasure to introduce Jonathan Schorsch to you. Jonathan Schorsch is one of the world's best-known specialists in early modern Jewish Atlantic history and Jewish-Black relations from a religious and historical perspective. Since 2015, Jonathan Schorsch is professor for Jewish religious and intellectual history at the School of Jewish Theology and a dear colleague of Professor Rauschenbach and mine at the University of Potsdam. He has published Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World with Cambridge University Press in 2004 and Swimming the Christian Atlantic, Judeo-Conversos, Afro-Iberians and Amerindians in the 17th century with Brill in 2009. Together with a number of important articles and book chapters on early modern Sephardic histories and cultures, he authored in 2018 The Food Movement, Culture and Religion, A Tale of Pigs, Christians, Jews and Politics with Paragraph in 2018. And Professor Rauschenbach and Professor Schorsch edited a collected volume titled The Sephardic Atlantic, Colonial Histories and Post-Colonial Perspectives, also with Paragraph in 2019. Today, Professor Schorsch will introduce us into the history of the Sephardim of the Atlantic world. And we are all very much looking forward to his presentation. Jonathan, welcome again to the Zentrum für Jüdische Studien. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's my pleasure and honor to be here with you all, or to be nowhere with you all together virtually. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. I provided you some visuals so you would have something to look at while you listen to me talk. I know some of you who are here, such as Tirza Levy Bernfeld, and I welcome you. And I want to just start off by saying anyone who knows this history very well, as does Tirza and Professor Rauschenbach, for instance, Zina, and anyone who comes from this background may find my lecture inadequate, but I really tried to start us off with an introduction. So without further ado, despite their small numbers, the Western Sephardim make up one of the more fascinating groups of Jews, at least in my opinion. The title of my lecture asks whether their scattered communities across the Atlantic coasts of Western Europe and the eastern coasts of the Americas formed an empire, a question that could be taken as being somewhat facetious or tongue-in-cheek. After all, their commercial domination and political savvy notwithstanding, their numbers were minuscule. They controlled no recognized territory, had no military and no unified government. Nonetheless, at the end of my talk, after reviewing their history all too quickly, I will take up this question of a Western Sephardic empire again. Let us start with some basics. Spanish exiles fled the Iberian Peninsula after the 1492 expulsion. This is the origin of the Western Sephardim, from the Jews who lived since Roman times in the territories of the Iberian Peninsula that later became Spain and Portugal. When they were expelled in 1492 from the Spanish kingdoms, they made their way to other lands. Many crossed the mountains into Portugal, but 5 years later, the Portuguese king, seeking to marry into the Spanish royal family, decided to forcibly convert all Jews in his realm. The conversos, who remained in Spanish and Portuguese territories, made their way abroad, when possible over the coming 3 centuries. Sorry, that bad inflection. The conversos who remained in Spanish and Portuguese territories made their way abroad, when possible, over the coming 3 centuries, whether out of fear of the Spanish and Portuguese inquisitions, in search of economic opportunities, to reunite with family members abroad, or in order to practice Judaism openly somewhere else. We do not know the numbers of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews at the time of the 1492 expulsion. Scholars give estimates ranging from 50,000 to 400,000. Expulsions in the 13th and 14th centuries had emptied the towns and cities of Western Europe of their Jewish populations. When exiled Spanish and Portuguese conversos arrived throughout the 16th century, they had no choice but to live as Catholics. Quickly, however, the Jewish inclinations of many of them became obvious to the local authorities. Both Protestant and later Catholic rulers opted to permit open Jewish life, mostly in the hopes that these Portuguese, as they were called, with strong commercial experience and connections, would contribute to the economy in this age of mercantilism. By the early 17th century, then, a constellation of Spanish and Portuguese communities sprung up across northwestern Europe, all of them established by merchant families, all of them tiny at first. Here on the map, you can see in the red the list of communities started by so-called Marranos or crypto Jews, people who were not yet living as open Jews, and in blue, the communities that were started by people or who were openly Jewish, or it lists the date when they began as open Jews. A continuing influx of conversos escaping from Spain and Portugal well into the 19th century, when the Inquisitions finally ceased operating, several thousand individuals in all helped grow these communities. Though descending from the Spanish and Portuguese Jews with their long and illustrious history and rich culture, since most of the newcomers had been born, raised, and educated as Catholics, historian Joseph Kaplan calls this a population of new Jews. Certainly at first, most of these newcomers had to learn Rabbinic Judaism, a way of life utterly foreign to them. Many of these newcomers came from families who had lived in Portugal, since the sudden conversion of the entire Portuguese community back in 1497, which included the Jews who had fled from Spanish territories, struck a community that was fiercely devoted to Judaism. The Portuguese king's granting of a 40-year grace period free of any inquisition after the conversion only strengthened the community's Jewish loyalties. Portuguese conversos and their open Jewish compatriots thus generally manifested a stronger Jewishness and more direct connection to Jewish knowledge than their Spanish counterparts. Therefore, many of these new communities were dominated by the Portuguese element. Influenced by and taking advantage of the colonial expansion of their new host countries, who were desperate for European settlers, over the course of the 17th century, the Portuguese communities of Europe established settlements in the Brazilian provinces captured by the Dutch, as well as Suriname, Curacao, St. Eustatius, the English colonies of Barbados, Jamaica, and the North American colonies, even French Martinique and Saint-Domingue, and the Danish island of St. Thomas. Eventually, communities were founded in places such as Richmond, Virginia, and even Montreal in Canada. The authorities of the mother communities in Amsterdam or London founded many of these settlements as an effort to seed commercial outposts and as destinations for Jews still traumatized by the 1492 expulsion and the Inquisitions, and still wary of discrimination even in Western Europe. A short-lived Jewish settlement at New Middelburg on the Paroma River along what was called the Dutch wild coast of South America that lasted perhaps 8 years stands as an excellent example of this program of Sephardic colonization. In 1658, two Portuguese leaders, Portuguese, of course, meaning Portuguese Jews, Portuguese leaders of a voyage across the Atlantic with new settlers wrote a report describing the colony in glowing terms, with friendly natives, temperate and healthy weather, and miraculous agricultural possibilities. The Portuguese language sales pitch, which you see a copy of here, or the first page, and call for new settlers was circulated among Sephardic communities across Europe. I will return in a few moments to the commercial aspects of this transatlantic network of families and communities. For now, you might have noticed that nearly every single community stood at or near a port. Hardly a coincidence, this network of Sephardic communities, with Amsterdam and then London as the centers, formed the basis for a thriving commercial archipelago, culture, and intertwined societies, calling itself and known by others simply as a Nassau, the nation. Amsterdam's community reached a peak of some 4,000 to 6,000 individuals in the 18th century. By the end of the same century, London claimed some 2,000 Sephardim, while Suriname's and Curaçao's numbers hit perhaps 1,500 each. Overall, the number of Western Sephardim at the height of their economic and cultural dominance in the late 17th and early 18th centuries might have reached 50,000. Even this might be a generous estimate. How much more remarkable their successes, given their demographic insignificance. Their transnational commercial success, while it lasted, comprises a doubly remarkable achievement, given, as Francesca Trivellato reminds us, that no country would have chartered an exclusively Sephardic commercial company, nor could Sephardic merchants raise capital among non-Jews to set up large-scale operations. But more on commerce later. It bears emphasizing, however, that Sephardic success notwithstanding, the majority of the population remained quite poor, with large numbers consistently unable to survive without charity. Let me turn first to the religious life of these communities, obviously a central feature of their experience. It is worth noting at the outset the remarkable toleration of these mostly Protestant societies toward these new Jewish communities. This toleration had economic, religious, and philosophical motivations. In some respects, Protestants found Jews less objectionable than they did Catholics, while also admiring Jews because of their own orientation toward the so-called Old Testament. And of course, economic reasons were fundamental. While still subject to some forms of popular and legal discrimination and exclusion, for the most part, Sephardim found their Protestant host societies having moved beyond medieval anti-Jewish laws. Sephardim could dress as they wished and live where they wished. In notoriously open and free-thinking 17th century Amsterdam, authorities still felt it wise to forbid interreligious polemics, however. Based on the traditions of the pre-expulsion Spanish and Portuguese Jews, with new input from Italian and Eastern Sephardic sages and rabbis, the Spanish and Portuguese forged a unique new form of Judaism, with a distinctive outlook, style, and aesthetics. Due to a population mostly ignorant of Judaism, indifferent or even hostile to rabbinic Judaism, the temptations of converso relatives and business opportunities in Catholic lands, the leadership tended towards strict and rigid orthodoxy. Public observance and adherence to the legal requirements of rabbinic Judaism was enforced, with fines and excommunication applied as warnings or punishment when necessary. Prayer services were formal and high church in style, mixing the Muslim-inflected Iberian modalities with the style of the Dutch or English Protestants, with frontal performance led by the Chazan and often accompanied by composed choral music. The collective annual cycle of Sabbaths, festivals, and prayers played a central role, as in all Jewish communities. Similarly standard, these initially small congregations generally gathered in private homes until they could rent or build a dedicated synagogue building, such as Eitz Chaim here in Amsterdam. Even if synagogue buildings were erected, communal meals and life cycle events such as weddings or circumcisions, among other things, generally took place in private homes. The newly built synagogues were as grand as each community could afford, glorious and simple at the same time. Again, partially Muslim style, partially in Protestant fashion. These were not imitation cathedrals like medieval Ashkenazic synagogues. In many ways, Amsterdam's Eitz Chaim synagogue, built in 1675, served as a model. And there were originally three other synagogues and an earlier synagogue for the unified community, but this glorious building that you saw on the previous slide and here on the right were built in 1675. The interior featured fixtures of jacaranda wood imported from Brazil. Its candelabra were copied by many of the synagogues throughout the Western Sephardic diaspora. In this era of incipient ethnography, particularly because Jews and Jewish life had not been known in most of these locations for several centuries, the Sephardic synagogues were sites of great interest to non-Jews, whose curiosity led them to visit often. This curiosity can be measured by the frequency of depictions of the synagogue by non-Jewish artists. Jews and their practices became an object of fascination, leading non-Jews to write about them alongside the quote-unquote exotic ways of non-European populations overseas. As in Bernard Picard's best-selling book, Religious Ceremonies and Customs of All the People of the World. The porousness between Jewish and non-Jewish urban lives in these relatively cosmopolitan places contributed to the self-consciousness of the Sephardic leadership, which insisted on a Judaism of dignity and decorum. Here is an image of the London synagogue, Shar HaShamayim, and also Bevis Marks, whose resemblance to Amsterdam's Eitz Chaim is noticeable immediately. In the colonies, synagogues were often the only official Jewish building and served even more central roles for the community. The wealthier colonial communities, such as Curacao, built impressive houses of worship. Curaçao's Mikveh Israel, the second synagogue building, which you see here, which was inaugurated in 1732, could house a congregation of 400 men and 200 women. So well off was the community that a membership contribution, the finta, was introduced only in 1810. Some of these colonial synagogues feature floors of sand. Various reasons are offered for this. One theory holds that the sand reflects the secrecy of conversos in the face of the Inquisitions, where the soft material muffled the sound of footsteps so that outsiders wouldn't hear. Another opinion attributes the sand to the biblical verses promising Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the world's grains of sand. Religious leaders expended efforts to provide conversos back in Spanish or Portuguese territories with Jewish texts. Writers produced martyrologies and eulogies for those martyred by the Inquisitions, such as these texts here. Rabbis wrote didactic literature and legal codes in Spanish or Portuguese for conversos who had recently become Jewish and remained unfamiliar with the value and requirements of rabbinic Judaism. Sorry, these are the examples, the covers of some of these texts. Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, in his Thesauro Dojudinim, his Treasury of Laws here on the left, from 1647, addresses women directly, revealing a rare effort to educate new Jewish women in Judaism or how to keep a Jewish household. In Amsterdam, businessmen who traveled to Spanish or Portuguese territories undercover as Catholics in order to do business were publicly punished. Circumcision, always a central mitzvah or commandment for Jews, took on added weight for the Sephardic new Jews, who transformed it into a kind of sacrament along Catholic lines. No man was allowed to join a Sephardic congregation unless he was circumcised. Talmud Torah schools for boys were quickly established in each new community that took its Jewish life seriously. Amsterdam, Livorno, London, Hamburg, and a school reported by enemies of the Jews on the island of Barbados in the 18th century. Yeshivot, advanced Jewish schools at different levels and with different emphases, were founded by wealthy patrons. The famous Eitz Chaim, which Eitz Chaim, by the way, means tree of life, the famous Eitz Chaim Academy of Amsterdam trained rabbis who went on to serve not only in the city itself, but throughout the Western Sephardic diaspora. Girls, at least from wealthy families, sometimes benefited from the hiring of a private tutor, though this seems not to have been widespread. We know that some women educated their children themselves, indicating that they knew enough Torah practices or Hebrew to do so. In the 18th century, we even hear of a Sephardic finishing school for girls in London. Western Sephardim continued and expanded the social organizations that helped them take care of their own and that originated in medieval Spain and Portugal. The activities of these benevolent societies were seen as a religious obligation. The Abi Yitomim confraternity or brotherhood, the father of the orphans, of Amsterdam, which was founded in 1648, looked to the education or training in or training in a trade of male orphans, while also providing them clothing. In return, the orphans provided services, such as accompanying funerals to the cemetery. Dowry societies raised money for poor and orphan brides at home and even in other parts of the Western Sephardic diaspora. Benevolent societies took care of the poor, establishing, for instance, in Amsterdam and London, poorhouses where residents were trained to work in crafts and hospitals. The Amsterdam community set up Mazon Abonot, the Sustenance for Orphans, a girls' orphanage in 1734, although the residents slept with host families. Among other daytime activities at the orphanage, they sewed or knit clothes on commission to provide income to their institution. Mazon Abonot even featured a rare female teacher, a maestra. Amsterdam also had a Portuguese old age home. The largest contingent of Sephardim in these different benevolent societies, such as Maskil Eldal, Enlightener of the Poor, or Tmimei Darech, straightforward people, consisted of women. These societies, or chevrot, or brotherhoods, were mostly intended as mutual aid organizations, besides being a venue for studying the holy law and taking care of the poor. That is the last few societies that I named. While all of the above societies were official communal entities, there were numerous private organizations as well, such as Sidkat Nasim, Charity for Women, Mishpat Abonot, Justice for Girls, and Parnasat Almonot, Livelihood for Widows. And much of this much of this information can be found in Tirza Levi Bernfeld's wonderful essay on women in Golden Age Amsterdam. The real leadership of the communities, however, were not the rabbis. It was the merchants. As was true in the medieval period, wealthy lay people dominated the community boards, the ma'amads. One of the principal values of Sephardic leadership was bom gobierno, which might be translated as good or proper governance. The focus was on maintaining order, fitting behavior, respectability. The Mahamad, the ruling board of each community, ruled with a firm hand. Adulterers were punished. Troublesome youths might be expelled or jailed temporarily. Cherem, excommunication, was employed to ensure honorable business practices and often to prevent anti-Semitic reactions. Purim customs in the synagogue and festivities in the streets then on Purim and on Simchat Torah, for instance, were not allowed to become indecorous or unruly. And we know, for instance, that both men and women participated in the masked and costumed Purim festivities that the rabbis frequently condemned. In accord with practices across Europe, poor individuals and families were given money if they agreed to ship off to the colonies. The rabbis perennially lamented and castigated the merchants and the wealthy for their lack of hospitality or their moral laxity. And here you can see the outside of the famous De Pinto house with all their servants, their fancy carriages. Sephardic societies, Rabbi Avraham Gabbai Isidro, an Eitz Chaim graduate who served in Suriname in the 1730s, chastised the community, including its parnasim, its leaders, for fraternizing with slave women. Sephardic societies were highly patriarchal. In keeping with Iberian norms, bom gobierno meant that women were kept out of public life almost entirely. Perhaps this stance even represented a turn against the strong and almost proverbial leadership exerted by women in crypto-Jewish circles. Perhaps not surprisingly, given their experience of marginalization and persecution back in Spanish and Portuguese lands, new Jews placed a very strong emphasis on loyalty to their own ethno-religious group, especially endogamy in marriage, as well as in business alliances. Western Sephardim tended to look down on their Eastern European Ashkenazic neighbors who arrived in the cities after the Sephardim, often fleeing persecution and lack of economic opportunity. The Sephardim disdained the insular, chaotic, and primitive Judaism, or at least in Sephardic eyes, the Judaism and lower class ways of these newcomers, so different from themselves. In many Sephardic communities, marriage with Ashkenazim was forbidden or frowned upon. Ashkenazim were not allowed to join Sephardic congregations or to be buried in their cemeteries. Dutch Sephardi women often made inheritance conditional on having children marrying members of the Spanish or Portuguese and Jewish nation. The benevolent society that provided dowries to poor and orphan brides would only support women who married men from the nation, Sephardic women also excluded family members from inheritance if the family members were not inclined to live in countries where Judaism could be professed openly. The thriving and complex social and cultural life of the Western Sephardim, heavily influenced by Iberian trends, defies quick summarization. In many communities, minutes of official meetings, such as those of the Mahamad, were kept in Portuguese until well into the 19th century. Amsterdam became a center of Jewish printing, pouring out hundreds of titles in all genres until well into the 18th century. Rabbis and scholars, such as Isaac Aboab de Fonseca and Menashe ben Israel, among many others throughout the major centers of the Western Sephardim, wrote biblical commentaries, theological and halachic works, translations from or into Spanish, printed up their sermons. The rabbis and sages of the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva produced a voluminous collection of their halachic rulings from throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. In 17th century Amsterdam, Sephardim formed multiple literary and philosophical societies in which even women participated. Poets and writers, professional and amateur alike, wrote poetry and plays in Spanish and Hebrew, including erotic poetry. Joseph de la Vega, among many authors, penned Baroque fictions, as well as the first description, both laudatory and critical, of the recently established Amsterdam stock market. Composers produced art music for the synagogues and their choirs. The wealthy and intellectual bought and read Spanish and Latin works of literature, history, philosophy, and geography. Even the Sephardic community of Suriname boasted a literary society toward the end of the 18th century. Gravestones, especially of the wealthy, became a means of collective and individual self-expression. In the bigger cities, Jewish servants frequently worked in Sephardic households. Pregnancies were one not infrequent result. Sephardic men frequented non-Jewish prostitutes, including at a brothel run by one Sephardic madam out of her home. Such cosmopolitanism was not universal among Western Sephardim. Ronald Schechter has asserted that the Sephardim in Bordeaux, for instance, were scarcely less separated from their Gentile neighbors than were their Ashkenazic brethren in Alsace, Lorraine, or Metz. Typifying the still lingering attitudes towards Ashkenazim across the Western Sephardic diaspora, as well as the distinct perceptions of non-Jews, French Sephardim were awarded citizenship by the Revolutionary National Assembly in 1791, a full year ahead of the Ashkenazic community. The foundation for all of this culture was commerce. Into the early 18th century, Western Sephardim, playing against far larger nation states with far more power, dominated a number of facets of transatlantic commerce. Through family networks that often included converso relatives still in Spanish or Portuguese territories, they traded in sugar, tobacco, indigo, cocoa, coffee, Mediterranean coral, and much more. In the Americas, Sephardic merchants imported Portuguese wine, produced and sold snuff, made and sold chocolate. Well over half of the Sephardic men in 17th century Amsterdam whose occupations are known functioned as merchants. Most Sephardic merchants, especially those operating internationally, took on multiple names, one for Jewish use and another for civic or business use. Sometimes they might have both an Iberian and Dutch or English name. Thus, Francisco de Medina also went by Francisco Rodriguez Lobo, and Frederick Wolf, Wolf being a translation of Lobo. Joseph Pereira, sometimes Joseph Israel Pereira, also used the name Francisco Rodriguez Pereira and called himself Carlos de Water, a half Spanish and half Dutch name, when doing business. His wife, Judith Harari, also used her family name, Lopez Teles. In French coastal cities, Sephardim fished for cod. In Bayonne, toward the end of the 17th century, Sephardim controlled 15% of the city's cod fishing and 72% of local transportation. French Sephardim controlled much of the tobacco trade with Spain. Sephardim in Amsterdam, banned from joining most guilds, ended up dealing with many colonial products. They sponsored trading voyages, insured ships, including slave ships, established sugar refineries. Remarkably, when the end of international military hostilities permitted it, Dutch Sephardim conducted trade with Spain, shipping manufactured goods from Northwest Europe, fish, wheat, wine, spices, linen, and cloth, for example, to Seville, Cadiz, and Basque ports such as Bilbao, in return for wool, wines, olive oil, raisins, figs, anise, almonds, American silver, and colonial goods such as dyestuffs. Sephardic merchants also traded with their counterparts in the Canary Islands. Dutch and English Sephardim dealt in jewels from India. Sephardim invested in the new overseas trading companies, such as the Dutch West India Company and the Royal African Company of England. In Amsterdam and London, Jews worked as brokers in the new stock exchanges set up in the late 17th century. In the English colonial orbit, Sephardic merchants had to negotiate state regulation, which saw Jews as at best resident aliens, and to gain commercial privileges or rights of residence. Moving from the relatively anarchic 17th century to the more ordered 18th century, Sephardic merchants continued to face legal and attitudinal discrimination, and hence felt greater pressure than their Christian counterparts to cultivate a strong and loyal customer base. Those who thrived in consumer retail trade, such as Aaron Lopez of Newport, knew how to comport themselves with the necessary social graces. They sold their customers the gentility and respectability they sought, and that to some degree could now be had for purchase through goods like stylish textiles, Portuguese wine, tea, snuff, or spermaceti candles. Women often worked alongside their husbands in the family trade, whether in crafts, the medical profession, international trade, local industries, retail, or other work-related activities. Many women worked for themselves, running a shop, handling retail trade, supplying the community with material for shrouds, owning a private pawn bank, serving as a midwife, renting lodgings to refugees, travelers, or children, or doing needlework such as knitting at home. In Amsterdam, Clara and Rachel Belillos were taught to be printers by their father, a teacher at the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, and were given the tools to print ketubot, or Jewish wedding certificates. The many benevolent organizations of the community, especially in the 18th century, provided jobs for women. Unlike Ashkenazi women, Sephardic women did not take on open-air work, such as vending at street markets or selling merchandise house to house. Despite the absence of women in public life, Sephardic husbands often granted their wives power of attorney to act in their place, permission to run their businesses when they traveled, or to administer their estate after their death. Many women carried on the family business after their husband passed away. Adolescent boys were often given over to apprenticeships to learn the skill of being a tailor, barber, or diamond cutter, the latter a trade that occupied many Sephardim in Amsterdam, or sent away to other Sephardic communities to learn the merchant trade. Even converso boys from Portugal were sometimes sent to the major Sephardic communities for apprenticeships. Merchant sons were often sent to other Sephardic communities as representatives or agents of the family firm in order to help expand the family firm's reach. The noteworthy commercial success of the Western Sephardim should not blind us to the risks and failures involved. Success was hardly guaranteed. Among other problems, as Francesca Trivellato has shown, family businesses and networks often collapsed or descended into internal squabbling. The Sephardic communities in the colonies, particularly the most successful ones in the 17th and 18th centuries, Suriname and Curacao, can be discussed as hybrids of commerce and culture. Most of these colonial communities began in the mid-17th century, especially after the defeat of the Dutch in Brazil in 1654, and they began as investments in plantation agriculture, that is, sugar. Many of the original Sephardic immigrants to the Caribbean from Brazil and elsewhere brought experience growing and processing sugar, while some Sephardim purchased and operated plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, Curacao, and in the northern English colonies, with slave labor, of course. For the most part, Sephardim in the Americas continued to practice commerce, allied to plantation agriculture. In Curacao, the soil turned out to be unsuited for agriculture. Suriname proved to be the one exception. Here, let me catch up. Here we go. This is a famous map of Suriname outlining the rivers and the many plantations. Suriname proved to be the one exception. And here you see a close-up, including, if your eyes are very good, the names of many of the Jewish plantations, the Sephardic plantations. And you can see the Judentums here, Judentums, Jewstown, in the center where this little hill is. If I can, let's see if I can move my cursor here, right there. And it's surrounded by Sephardic plantations up and down the Paramaribo River. Here in Suriname, Sephardim ended up owning and running some 415 plantations by the height of the colony's economic success in the mid to late 18th century. Judentums, Jewstown, an inland settlement rather far up the Paramaribo River, grew into the center of this Sephardic agricultural society within a colony, kind of colony within a colony. Curacao stood out for a different reason. Unlike any other Sephardic community in the Atlantic world, the merchants of the island of Curacao invested in buying and building ships, a sensible and cost-cutting focus given their reliance on maritime transportation. Some 200 ships were owned and operated by Sephardim across the 17th and 18th centuries out of Curacao. By the mid to late 18th century, the Sephardic communities of Curacao and Suriname stood as active, wealthy, proud stars in the Sephardic constellation. Sephardim in the Americas who could afford to imported marble from their counterparts in Europe for their own gravestones. Conversos and new Jews who had been commercially active on the west coast of Africa in the early 17th century brought back mixed-race children and Black or mixed-race servants to Amsterdam. In Recife, in Dutch Brazil, the slave market was in fact located on Rua dos Judeus, Jew Street. Some of these slaves or Blacks had converted to Judaism, while others did not. Eager to fit in and appear respectable, the community leadership in Amsterdam reacted over the coming decades with a series of regulations marginalizing and excluding non-whites who were not halachically Jewish, and in some cases, even those who were. In Curacao, slaves and free Blacks were unwelcome to become Jewish, and nearly none did until the later 18th century. Surinamese Sephardim at first seemed to have brought some slaves, usually lighter-skinned house slaves, into Judaism. But here too, community leaders reacted with racialist exclusionary legislation. Despite this, a small population of Black or mixed-race Jews developed, numbering perhaps 200, a totally rough estimate, through the 17th and 18th centuries. While often made Jewish in new and flexible ways rather than halachically, even these individuals often faced an ambivalent reception. Across the Caribbean, the overwhelming majority of slaves belonging to Sephardim were not converted to Judaism. At least that's my conclusion from my own research. Those who sometimes were found acceptance in their new Jewish families, were given the family surname, functioned in the family business, and married within the Jewish community. Many others, however, met with less hospitable treatment. In my own publications, I've argued that the loosening, if not ignoring, of Jewish laws regarding slaves by Sephardic slave owners and community leaders marks one way Western Sephardim turned towards secular civic behavior and modernity. By the early 19th century, Surinamese Sephardic leaders solved the problem from their perspective, a problem of non-white Jews by ensuring that all mixed-race children were educated by Dutch Reformed educators, meaning outside the Jewish community. Race has remained a fraught question in Atlantic world Sephardic communities until today, however. Despite their religious conservatism, Western Sephardic cosmopolitanism was noticeable, strong enough that historian Joseph Kaplan considered their path already in the 17th century as an alternate path to modernity. Amsterdam in particular was notorious as a haven for openness, tolerance, and free thinking. Christian Hebraists studied and socialized with Sephardim, such as Menashe ben Israel. Sephardic communities were roiled by the same kinds of controversies that stirred many of the Jewish and non-Jewish communities of the era. Due to the anti-rabbinic fervor of Catholicism that many conversos imbibed in their youths, many Sephardic new Jews had trouble adhering to or even appreciating some aspects of rabbinic Judaism, such as its emphasis on observance of the law and its unabashed use of public pressure and coercion, which for some reeked of the methods of intolerant Catholicism and the Inquisition. Uriel da Costa and Baruch de Spinoza, among others, exemplified the push for free thinking in the early 17th century, though they were hardly alone in this. Belief in the false messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, swept the Western Sephardic world in the mid-17th century, with repercussions that lasted for decades. Rationalism and deism appealed to many Sephardic intellectuals, including rabbis such as David Nieto of London and Joshua Chizkiyahu de Cordova in Jamaica. Even in the sphere of religion, the Sephardim in certain respects showed more leniency than the Ashkenazim. In the 17th century, for instance, some Sephardic rabbis permitted men to shave their beards, or not to stop shaving during the counting of the Omer, the 49 days between Passover and Shavuot. Indeed, Western Sephardic men were often called shaven Jews, in contradistinction to their Ashkenazi counterparts who maintained beards. General acculturation picked up speed. By the 18th century, Sephardim in the Netherlands and England who had grown wealthy as investors bought landed estates and lived on their income from investments. Already in the 18th century, it seems that Sephardic religiosity in the Netherlands and England, for instance, sank in importance. One rabbi complained that the women of his day dressed immodestly and even allowed their hair to be visible. Indeed, wealthy Sephardic women and men dressed exactly like their non-Jewish counterparts. Evidence tells us that Western Sephardim routinely ignored halachic prohibitions on charging interest even to other Jews. In the 19th century, we find figures such as Grace Aguilar in England, poet, historical romance writer, domestic novelist, Jewish emancipator, religious reformer, educator, social historian, theologian, and liturgist. Aguilar published her first fictional work, Records of Israel, in 1844, on the subject of Iberian Jews devastated by enforced exile from their beloved motherland, which was not, of course, Israel or Jerusalem, but Spain. In her teens, she had written her first romance on this theme, The Veil of Cedars, or The Martyr, a story of the heroic suffering of a crypto-Jewish woman in Inquisition Spain, which was published only in 1850 after her death. Much of Aguilar's work resonated with the anti-Catholic climate of early Victorian England. While often striving to illustrate the theological congruences between Judaism and Protestantism, she also repeatedly sought to identify Jews with the Protestant nation that had given them refuge from Catholic persecution, and that, she insisted, had inspired in them a new patriotism. Aguilar's work was published during the time that Jews were campaigning for political emancipation, and her fiction can be seen as part of the effort to portray Jews as loyal Englishmen and women worthy of equal civil rights. The nonfiction work that Aguilar chose to publish during her lifetime focused on defenses of Judaism directed towards a Jewish readership. The Spirit of Judaism in 1842, The Jewish Faith in 1846, a series of fictional letters to a young Jewish woman urging her to resist the temptations of conversion, and The Women of Israel in 1845, in which, by recreating the lives and careers of Jewish women in biblical and post-biblical history in terms that made them familiar and appealing to the Victorian Jewish woman reader, she attempted to counter missionary arguments that Judaism denigrated women and had nothing to offer them. While strongly opposing Christian polemic, Aguilar's book nonetheless registered the worry that Jewish women were indeed undereducated and vulnerable to religious persuasion. Another Sephardic poet, Amy Levy, novelist as well and journalist, who lived later in the century, was among the first Jewish women to go to Cambridge University. She traveled widely in Europe alone and with other women, and her life as a writer was conducted among a circle of liberal intellectual friends who met at the British Library in London and who attended progressive discussion groups. Levy identified with the aims of late Victorian feminism. In 1888, she wrote a series of articles for the London newspaper, The Jewish Chronicle, confidently and often humorously critical of the contemporary Jewish community. These included Middle-Class Jewish Women of Today, a piece in which she castigated Anglo-Jewry's treatment of women as outdated, primitive, and oriental. The young Jewish women, she wrote, The young Jewish woman, she argued, is taught to suppress her healthy, objective activities, her natural employment of her young faculties, and to look upon marriage as the only satisfactory termination to her career. In her novel Reuben Sachs from 1888, Levy also drew attention to the plight of Jewish women condemned to the uncertain vagaries of the marriage market. The story relates the career of a young Jewish lawyer, Reuben Sachs, who, at the encouragement of his ambitious family, abandons his romance with the intelligent and beautiful but impoverished heroine Judith Quijano in order to pursue a life in politics. But he dies of overwork before he can take up office. The novel is actually more interested in Judith's fate, who is left to a loveless marriage and exile from her own Anglo-Jewish community. She comes to a bitter yet wiser understanding of her own capacity for passion only at the end of the novel, when she has lost all hope of fulfilling it. In the 19th century, many Sephardim fell away from Judaism, perhaps even directly because of official Judaism's conservatism. Most of the leadership remained determined to preserve the noble heritage of the past, of course. But others sought new paths and pastures. Some converted to Christianity, some became involved with Freemasonry, some took up the Enlightenment's and Emancipation's promise of a neutral civil society that included everyone. In both Europe and the Caribbean, intermarriage with Ashkenazim as well as with Christians increased enormously. It is not surprising that some of the cosmopolitan Sephardim were attracted by the reform movement within Judaism. Charlestown, Virginia, their Sephardic Beit Elohim synagogue became the first permanent Reform congregation in the United States in 1841. Confirmations instead of bar mitzvahs were introduced in St. Thomas, the Dutch island, in the 1840s. In Curacao, a group of reformers broke away from the main congregation in 1864, forming a new Reform congregation, Emmanuel. Despite the innovation in the main Orthodox synagogue of a mixed choir, even though the men and the women there sang from different enclosures. Alice Blanche Rodriguez da Costa, typical of 19th century Atlantic world Sephardim. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1861. While her father, Jacob Rodriguez da Costa, was Jewish, his wife, Selina, her mother, was not. Alice Blanche was baptized and grew up a Roman Catholic. Already in the 18th century, the Sephardic merchants of Europe had begun to lose their niche and their dominance. Economic decline set in, which led to cultural stagnation. The 19th century decline of the Caribbean economies and thus of the Sephardic communities there led to outward migration. From Curacao, for instance, Sephardim left for other Jewish communities in places such as St. Thomas, London, Chicago, and New York, but also, surprisingly, to Catholic territories, such as Santo Domingo, Panama City, or Coro in Venezuela, and Barranquilla in Colombia. The same outmigration beset all of the relatively small and isolated Caribbean communities. By the 20th century, the network of shining triumphs operated largely in preservation mode. Yet Sephardic pride lingered on. Whoops, wrong slide, sorry. Yet Sephardic pride lingered on. Threatened by the Nazis, some Dutch Sephardim tried to persuade them that the Sephardim comprised an entirely different strand of Jews and Judaism and should not be persecuted like the Ashkenazim. The effort failed. Let me get back to the question of empire. Sorry for my slides in the wrong order. Historian Jonathan Israel wrote famously that the Western Sephardim were both agents and victims of empire. While true, I want to push this formulation into more provocative territory and argue that in some respects, these new Jews and their descendants managed to build an empire of sorts themselves. Though lacking unified government, contiguous territory, or a military, Western Sephardim created a network of closely interwoven communities. While each community functioned autonomously, most looked toward the leadership of the mother communities of Amsterdam and London for support and guidance. Policy was coordinated to a surprising degree, and not just when it came to religion. The establishment of new settlements in the Americas seems to have happened as a hybrid of the initiative of individual entrepreneurs or groups of them, and the Mahamads or community boards in Amsterdam and London. Sephardic entrepreneurs negotiated the terms of settlement grants with the national and colonial authorities with admirable confidence, obtaining favorable outcomes. For instance, tax breaks, subsidized land and slaves, and freedom of religion, that showed the Sephardic parties understood well how they were needed by the national colonial entities and that they negotiated from a position of strength. In some cases, Western Sephardim seems to have had official political representation. Joao da Rocha Pinta, alias Joseph Zachariah Cohen da Rocha, served in Amsterdam as the consul of the Portuguese nation. In early modern states, all foreign nations had consuls. Was this an elected position? And by whom? What tasks did this position entail? To whom did the consul report? Did he represent only the Jewish segment of the nation or Catholics also? How long did such a position exist? And did Western Sephardim have other positions elsewhere in the same manner? The successful colonies, such as Suriname and Curacao, were held up by Sephardim as well as by non-Jews as models of and for Jewish civic participation. Sephardic poets in Europe, such as Benvenida Belmonte, lauded the triumphs of Sephardim in Suriname. David Nassi in Suriname, about whom Zina, Professor Rauschenbach, has written, wrote an homage to the Surinamese Sephardim, his well-known historical essay on the colony of Suriname from 1785, in which he pointed to Sephardic self-governance, success with plantation agriculture, and service in the militias that fought the runaway slaves known as Maroons as rebuttals of common anti-Jewish tropes, and as a means of showing how modern the Sephardim in Suriname were. Paradoxically, perhaps even perversely, the greatest uniqueness of the Western Sephardim is actually their political, economic, and social domination over a large population of enslaved Africans in the colonies. The colonial Sephardic communities as a whole controlled the bodies, labor, and much of the lives of possibly 100,000 enslaved individuals and families. Such Jewish reign over non-Jews is unprecedented since perhaps the fall of Judea in the 1st century. Pushed by both fear and resentment, Sephardim in both the Dutch and English worlds opposed emancipation of the slaves and giving the vote to free people of color. Yet the question of history and racial complexity within the Sephardic world remained unresolved. Not only did many Western Sephardim benefit from and contribute to European colonization, they themselves colonized a sizable population of Africans, absorbing not a few of them into their own communities and families. Today, in Amsterdam, for instance, I don't know why my slides are out of order, but forgive me. Today in Amsterdam, for instance, Afro-Surinamese, whether of Jewish descent or not, I don't know, and others hold an annual ceremony for Eliezer, the 17th century good servant, quote unquote, of Isaac de Pinto, the merchant whose slide I showed earlier. This event, not necessarily appreciated by today's Amsterdam Sephardim, marks an effort to recuperate a victim of Sephardic imperialism and to decolonize Sephardic history. I have even been approached by a descendant of a prominent Sephardic family, some of whose members owned slaves in the past, who wanted to discuss with me the idea of Sephardic reparations to the descendants of these former slaves. Such conversations bring us a long way from the traditional apologetic, positive, community building and identity strengthening functions of Jewish studies, or wissenschaftlichen Judentums. Despite their economic, social, and cultural decline, many descendants of Western Sephardim in the 20th century highlighted the pride and even the haughtiness and arrogance that families bequeathed to their children. Many, both from within these communities or outsiders looking in, have noted their insularity and backward-focused nostalgia. On the other hand, some Caribbean Catholics of Sephardic descent insist that their Sephardic ancestry guaranteed that they were brought up in homes where a moral life, liberal ideas, and education were valued above all. Enlightened German Jews in the 19th century also used Sephardim as a means of critiquing Ashkenazic religious extremism and cultural separatism. Sephardim, in their eyes, that is in the eyes of 19th century German enlighteners or Maskilim, Sephardim have never formed the contrast to Christian society, which was so striking in the other family of Jews kept intentionally apart, that is the Ashkenazim. For these German Jews, Sephardim were marked by cultural openness, philosophic thinking, and an appreciation for the aesthetic. I will leave it to you to decide how to evaluate Western Sephardic history and the Western Sephardic experience. To my mind, it both typifies and defies Jewish history in ways I believe should provoke much thought. And with that, I finish and thank you very, very much for your patience, for listening,